then you burst into fire. Forever.
Hello, listeners.
You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
Listeners, we're going to tell it to you, and we're going to tell it to you straight.
Today, we're talking about Lolita.
I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
It was Laura, and I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
So, Indigo, why are we talking about Lolita?
Well, we're talking about it because David Lynch loves Lolita. He's mentioned it before. He even screened it for the cast of Eraserhead. He's referred to it numerous times in interviews and books, saying that it is one of his favorite films. So this is what we're calling a tangible resonance on this podcast. As we mentioned in the pilot, there are going to be sort of different ways that we relate to and bring up things in the podcast. So again, this is a tangible resonance. This is because Lynch has publicly expressed his affinity for Lolita and has mentioned that it has affected his work.
Great. I do think it gets even more interesting, though, because the film Lolita is based on a novel of the same name by Vladimir Nabokov, but they're very, very different. So maybe like our thesis, our kind of main idea here in this episode is that while Lynch's work definitely shows the influence of the film Lolita, Lynch is thematically much closer to Nabokov's novel in really important ways.
So the novel Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov was published in 1955, and it is about the sexual enslavement of a child named Dolores Hayes by a psychopathic monster, narrated by that monster. If you haven't read it, it really is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, it is still the most frightening book that I've ever read.
Yeah, it just, I think the main thing is really because we're hearing it from his perspective, it is just so horrifying to see the ways that he is justifying his actions. But the film by Stanley Kubrick, released in 1962, is not really that frightening.
Not at all. Not at all. It's actually quite funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it tells a really different story. Instead of a psychopathic monster who enslaves a child, Kubrick's Humbert is, I'd say, like an innocent romantic.
Yeah.
In a heartless, depraved world.
Yeah. And although, the film Humbert and Lolita have that dysfunctional relationship, instead of how it is in the book, this Lolita is always in a position of power and control over him. Like from the start, she is shown manipulating him, deceiving him, outwitting him. And we don't really fear for her in the way that we do when we're reading the book. It seems like she's got a control on the situation, even sort of extorting him for money in the end.
Right.
But in the book, it is much more serious and sinister.
Yes, she is clearly a victim.
Yes.
And he is a monster. I think that's why the film is watchable. And I think that's why, I read the novel years ago, reread it multiple times for this episode, of course.
Yeah.
But I had not seen the film.
Right.
Had you seen the 1962?
I had seen it a long time ago when I went through a sort of phase of just watching a lot of sort of the classic movies.
Yeah.
It was like I had a lot of downtime after graduating high school and was floundering. And so I definitely had a sort of period of time watching a lot of stuff. But I hadn't watched it. At that time, I watched this one and also the newer one with Dominique Swain as Lolita. But I had not rewatched it since around that time. So I just recently rewatched it for this episode. And yeah, it was even just the difference between this version of it, as opposed to the newer one, we've talked a little bit about that. I feel like in the newer one, they do make him a bit more sinister. They make Lolita less controlling, I think.
Yeah. I think I was afraid to see the movie because I found reading the novel so harrowing.
Oh, yeah.
So frightening. And I, admittedly, when I first learned that Lynch loved this film and took so much inspiration from it, it disturbed me a little because I thought, like, not my David Lynch.
Right,
like,
not my
how?
David.
And then when I watched the movie, I was like, oh, this is why. This is funny.
It's kind of campy.
It is. And it was thoroughly enjoyable. It's definitely watchable.
Yes.
So, listeners, if you're hesitating, please watch Lolita. Yes. It's worth it. Okay. Now, to ward off the, quote, actually crowd, right? You know, Nabokov is credited as the author of the screenplay for Kubrick's film. But this is kind of misleading, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, so the screenplay that he actually wrote was 400 pages long. And then Kubrick's producer, James Harris, famously said, you couldn't make it, you couldn't lift it, you know? And so it's like we see this incredibly long screenplay, very much more detailed to the book probably.
Also, Peter Sellers, right? He goes off script and improvised a lot of his scenes. So, in short, not a lot of Nabokov's original vision survived in the film.
No. And especially, again, when we talk about how there are so many stark differences between the book. I mean, of course, it happens all the time, right?
Yes.
The comparison of book to film adaptations. But it's just like it kind of becomes an entirely different story.
It is an entirely different story. Now, you and I have had a lot of long conversations about these contrasts between the film Lolita and the novel. But in planning this episode, we've chosen to leave out a lot of that detail. We'd love to talk about it.
Yes, we can for hours.
But we want to keep this under 4 hours.
Yes.
And we want to make sure we're focused on the connections that we see with David Lynch's work.
Yes.
So why don't we start with where we see the film Lolita's resonance in his work?
Yes. So we kind of broke this into a bookish sort of
how quaint, how typical of us.
Yes, you know, two English people. So starting sort of chapter 1, we're looking at men humbled by recalcitrant objects.
All right, so this is our most tangible resonance of all of them, okay? So in the book Lynch on Lynch, which is edited, of course, by Chris Rodley, David Lynch describes a scene that he loves in the film Lolita. Should we just read it?
Yes, I love this quote, honestly.
Okay, all right. Do you want to read it?
I think you should.
Okay,
I think
I'll read it. I'll read it.
You've got the book in your hands.
Okay. You do such a good David Lynch voice.
I know. I do my best.
I'm going to just read it in my own voice.
I think that's fair.
Okay. Well, one of my favorite films, this is quoting Lynch, one of my favorite films is Lolita, and one of the greatest scenes features this folding bed. The bellhop and James Mason, that's the actor who plays Humbert. That's my voice. Okay, back to Lynch. Put this bed in the room when Sue Lyon is asleep, and they don't want to wake her up. Some people are not mechanically minded, and some machines are simple things that are not user-friendly. There are so many absurd things in that. When we were shooting that scene in Twin Peaks, the chairs were there, and then things started to develop. Cooper and Sheriff Truman have to be quiet. Ronette's obviously very disturbed, and so it puts a tension in there and an absurd sort of humor at the same time. And it's a truth of life that some things are not built so well, and they become complicated, and they need to be figured out, and they're hard to figure out.
Yeah, very David Lynch. It's just like, it's one of those things that it doesn't surprise me at all that he was charmed by that scene, because I mean, the thing is, like, we were talking about it a bit while we were planning this, and so I mean, it's so ridiculous.
It's
that
ridiculous.
Scene.
Yes.
It's just like the porter is so loud too. He just keeps making these like he's like, oh, thank you, sir, and stuff, and he's like, shh, shh, shh. But it really downplays the seriousness of the moment.
Yes.
In a horrifying way, because when he arrives at the door when he gets back to the hotel room, he is planning to do the most disgusting thing, the most horrifying thing to Lolita, which is to assault her for the first time. But the hotel porter is at the door with this cot and essentially kind of like ruins the moment for him.
Yes, right. In the novel, of course, this is a really harrowing moment because Humbert has attempted to drug Lolita.
Yeah.
So there's nothing funny in the novel
Right.
at this moment. And so this is all Kubrick's creation.
Right.
And I love that David Lynch loves this. And I really like the connection that he's sharing with us here with Harry and Cooper fumbling with those chairs
Right.
in Ronette's hospital room in season 2, episode 2.
Yeah, and I think honestly, I hear it all the time from people when I talk about Twin Peaks or his work, on a larger scale, that that is like a thing that we know about David Lynch's work. Like that's like a hallmark sort of scene, is like these scenes where it seems very serious, but it is just like comedic. It is
Right.
just like things just keep going wrong. We talked about like the incompetent hitman in
Yes.
Mulholland Drive,
Right.
which is just it is just the most ridiculous scene. And it's like something very serious is happening. He is murdering people, but it is so funny because
Right.
everything just it's like slapstick.
Is.
It's slapstick
It
at the
is.
end of the day.
It really seems, I mean, if the recalcitrant object in that, I mean, the vacuum cleaner is definitely one
Yeah.
of them, right?
Oh, yeah.
That vacuum cleaner really humbles our hitman.
It really does.
And his own gun does too, and to an extent, right?
it's just nothing's working out for him.
We have felt like him so many times.
Yeah.
Where else do we see this? I have in my notes Henry in the elevator in Eraserhead.
Yes.
That's such an iconic moment, of course, when he's in the lobby of his apartment building and he goes and he's clutching his bag and he goes and stands there in the elevator and just waiting and waiting for it to close. And it feels like with every moment that he's waiting, he's just getting smaller and humbler, waiting for this machine to do what it's supposed to do. So although he's not wrestling with it, I do think it's a kind of similar feeling to Kubrick's Humbert being humbled by this cot.
Yeah, I mean, in the scene, if you folks haven't seen it, you should. I mean, it's literally like a clamshell. It just keeps closing on them and just
Yes.
swallowing them into it. It is so ridiculous. And then even once he gets it together and gets it set up, then it collapses.
Yes.
It like lowers once he lays down on it.
Yeah, he basically sleeps on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned when we were just discussing before we started recording about Straight Story.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. That movie is so unbelievably endearing. It is so heartfelt. It is so wholesome. And there are so many scenes like this in that movie where it's just, I mean, of course, the whole thing too, right, is that he is traveling across the country on a tractor. So it's like, of course, he's going to have issues with it because that's an insane thing to try to do with a tractor.
Right.
But it's what he's got. It's what he's got to work with. And so there's like a lot of very like slapstick scenes of it, firing back at him and stuff, like having issues with it. And just like as he's going through all of these towns and meeting people and everything, like there's a lot of really just sort of silly little slapstick moments that are, I don't know, it's sort of, the point of this too is that it also keeps things sort of light, right?
Yeah.
Because at the heart of it, that story is heartbreaking. It's
Straight
that he's
story.
it's that he is traveling across the country to see his dying brother that they haven't spoken, and it's a really heart-wrenching story, but it's kept light by these slapstick moments, by heartfelt connections that he has with people along the road, along his journey. The way that it's this sort of courageous thing for him. But it keeps it so that it doesn't feel too heavy. It doesn't feel too
Sure.
dark. And I think people that I've talked to about David Lynch's work, that's like a common thing that people will agree on, is he knows exactly how to keep it from being absolutely devastating all the time. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't times where he's like, I am gonna ruin your life, but he kind of balances it.
Yeah, right. I think it's really neat to see that. I mean, David Lynch speaks of that directly, very, very tangible resonance. And so we expand it here beyond Twin Peaks, that one scene in Twin Peaks, to these other moments. And so listeners, maybe you have observations on this too. Do you see men humbled by recalcitrant objects and other moments of Twin Peaks? Yeah, we'd love to hear about it.
Let us know.
Should we move on to chapter 2?
Let's do it.
So we're calling our chapter 2 The Juxtaposition of Tones.
So, for example, in the opening scene of Lolita, we
The film.
we sort of start backwards. Like we start with the end, and then
Of the novel.
novel, and then we sort of go back to the beginning. You know, kind of a classic film trope, I think.
Yeah.
But so that ending scene that we open on is when James Mason's Humbert is about to kill Pete Sellers' character, which is Claire Quilty. And this is a very serious moment.
You'd think.
You would think. But Quilty doesn't let it be that.
No, like Humbert comes in absolutely grave and serious, like you're about to die, to Quilty. And Quilty jokes. He insists on playing ping pong with Humbert.
Just so silly.
He has a seeming like infinite supply of ping pong balls in his toga sheet that he's wearing. And I think a really funny moment to me is like Humbert has prepared, as in the novel, this like solemn poetic letter that's going to explain to Quilty why he's going to die, like why he deserves death. And Peter Sellers Quilty pulls it out and starts reading it in this ridiculous accent.
He's just joking the entire time.
He kind of sounds like Foghorn Leghorn from like the old from the old Looney Tunes. Like it's so ridiculous. And so all of Humbert's really profound, serious words are just coming out as nonsense.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, partly for sure, that is like Quilty trying to sort of downplay the situation and also kind of make fun of Humbert.
Oh, absolutely ridiculing Humbert in what's supposed to be his like heroic moment here of killing Quilty.
Right.
The thing that's really interesting though is that Quilty's silliness for a little while seems to prevent Humbert from killing him.
Yeah. Because I think he's just so confused.
Yeah.
He's so like, what is going on here? I don't understand why you're acting like this.
Right.
He's like, you do like, he's like holding the gun. He's like, you know, I'm here to kill you.
Yeah.
And you're laughing.
Right. it like really sort of unmoors Humbert, but I think also the audience too.
Oh, yeah.
I think that we feel really kind of, we don't know what to feel. Are we supposed to be afraid of Humbert? Are we worried about Quilty? It's a really interesting way to start a film because the audience, the viewer, has no idea what the, quote, right way to feel is.
Right.
Yeah. We don't know what emotional state we should be identifying with.
Right, because also at this point in the film, we've only just met these characters.
Correct. Yeah.
We are yet to find out their connection. At this point, like if you were going in having no knowledge of the film, no knowledge of the novel, you would be very confused. You would be like, okay, because even when he's reading the letter, it doesn't really completely give away what is going on because also he barely gets through it.
Right.
So
Right.
But it's this, he acts in such a manic, frenzied, sort of clownish way that we can't help but see in Dr. Jacoby.
Yes. Good. Absolutely. I think we both made that note independently.
Yeah.
There's a lot of places where we'll talk about juxtaposition of tone, but Quilty, to quote you, Indigo, Quilty is so Jacoby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He just is, because it's just this, again, like very like kind of manic way of just like acting very goofy and silly and making light of like very serious things. And I feel like we see Jacoby do that time and time again in these like very serious situations. He's like, ooh, ha! And he's got his silly little glasses and his silly little Hawaiian stuff. Like he's like trying to act very silly.
We should say seasons 1 and 2 Jacoby.
Yes,
Right.
to clarify.
We're not talking about Dr. Amp.
No. I mean, that's a whole other conversation.
It is. My note was particularly the first questioning of Jacoby by Cooper in the sheriff's station. You know, Jacoby's like making something disappear. Is it a ping pong ball?
I think maybe. So even maybe more cool.
Weird. But there's some sort of thing he's like fiddling with. And Cooper is just sitting there stone faced, like not the slightest bit impressed with these antics. But again, it is in a sense like Quilty's silliness successfully disarming in a way, like a successful defensive weapon, at least temporarily.
And we see like the Horn brothers do this all the time too. They act so ridiculous while they are also horrifying men doing horrible things.
Wow. Yeah, we did not discuss that.
I know. It just came to my head as we were talking about it. Just
they're
the way they're
dancing
around, they're singing, you know, and Leland does it too. You know, it's just like these like bizarre and the thing is like Quilty acts that way. It's like he's very much like hopping and skipping and dancing around, putting on these silly accents. He's like, let's play ping pong. I'm going to sit at the piano and play us a little tune.
Yeah, right. While something incredibly serious is happening.
Right.
I think it has a really interesting effect, of course, in Lolita, but throughout David Lynch's work.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that is kind of the classic Lynch moment where there's this comedy combined with the deadly serious.
Right.
Since he screened this for the cast of Eraserhead, it's worth noting that, I think we both think that the dinner scene at the ex's house in Eraserhead also captures this juxtaposition of tone that we see in Lolita.
Yeah, I mean, we had kind of mentioned that that's one that I've had the pleasure to see in theaters. Obviously, not when it first came out, but since then, and that is for sure a scene that people are laughing out loud when it's happening because it's just so ridiculous and bizarre.
Yes,
it's almost like you don't know how else to react to it except to laugh.
Yes, and I'm always a little bit grateful when I watch that scene for Mr. X because Mr. X is so goofy right? And so friendly. It's where everyone else is so frightening and bizarre, right? He's like, she'll be all right after Mrs. X has some sort of weird orgasmic fit at the table. You know, and even his weird frozen smile and everything. It's a clear difference in tone between Mr. X and Mrs. X or Mary there at the table. So it reminds me also of this Quilty and Humbert thing from the film.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, we could probably go on that one.
Yeah, I think that it's a lot of these topics that we are going to be mentioning. Honestly, there are dozens, if not, I don't even know, just an insane amount of examples. Just truly an insane amount of examples.
Yes.
I don't want to say hundreds because that might be too much, but maybe not. I don't know.
Well, I think our final chapter in terms of like the direct resonances we see with the film Lolita is chapter 3, which we're calling The Hapless Innocent in a Depraved World.
Yep.
So, shockingly for anyone who has read the novel, film Lolita's Humbert is, in the words of, again, Kubrick's producer, Harris, the only innocent person in the piece. Humbert is so insane. The only innocent person in the piece.
Which is just, again, it's just so insane. If you have read the novel and you know how sinister and horrifying he is, it's like, I'm sorry, what?
I have a lot of questions.
Right? But yeah, they show him surrounded by these like slimy, scheming, perverted, selfish, crazy adults. Like he is just surrounded by people that are honestly just like his character in the novel. It's like anywhere he goes where he's interacting with other adults, there's like a scene where they're like swingers trying to like get him into bed. It's like any time that he's like talking to women, like her piano teacher, even she's like, maybe you can just come over and like I'll play piano for you.
Yeah.
Everyone's trying to like proposition him in a way.
Absolutely.
And like of course with Dolores's mother, Charlotte, like she is throwing herself at him and he's disgusted by it. It's like he looks around, when we look at it through his eyes, all these like adults, especially adult women, are just so needy and disgusting to him. He's so put off by them. It feels like they are trying to like force themselves upon him, which is exactly what he's doing to Lolita
in the novel. Yeah. So again, Indigo is talking about the film that we do see Humbert. And I think that we even take his point of view in the film. We see these other women as, and men, frankly, as needy and scheming and gross. It's not
very
like
cringeworthy, like the ways that they're talking to him and stuff. We're like, ooh, get away from them.
Yeah, we don't feel sorry for the women,
Right.
or men. We feel sorry for Humbert in the film. Our sympathies are all centered on him.
Right. But when we actually think about the book, it's like complete opposite.
It is. Yeah. But so in the film, like, you know, we've got this Humbert who obviously he does a terrible thing, right? He falls in love with a teenage girl. But it's an awful world in the film. And it's almost no wonder that he falls in love with what seems like a really sweet, innocent teenager. She's the only one as innocent as he is.
Right.
On the
That's the way he
surface.
sees her, for sure.
Yeah. What other options does he have?
Right. It's just like he makes it as if, you know, he's surrounded by all of these disgusting adults. These women his own age are so revolting to him that like then when he sees Lolita for the first time in that first scene, she's like a ray of light.
She is. Yeah.
Like she's like glowing in that scene.
She is. And importantly, she looks like a beautiful young woman and not like a child.
Yeah. And she's supposed to be 12 years old. And also, I mean, so the actress who played her, Sue Lyon, she was 14, which is still very young in this role. Like they actually got an actual child.
They did. But she, Humbert is attracted to a beautiful young woman. Novel Humbert, so from the book, he's worried about what will happen after Lolita experiences puberty and becomes a woman. He's actually planning to maybe kill her and get rid of her in Mexico.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't want her to look like a young woman. He's only attracted to her because she is a little girl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the book Lolita is described very much as a child.
Yes.
Like she's not glamorized the way that she is in the film. She is described as being this like grubby little kid.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, but in the film there's like scenes where, you know, he's like painting her toenails and like she's so glamorous the whole time. She's got like her hair's always like a beautiful fluffy do, you know.
Yeah.
And it's like that's not at all how we meet Lolita in the novel.
No, definitely not. Okay.
But that's what he likes about her in the novel.
It is. It's so disgusting. Okay, but back to the film, because you can tell that we
True. Yeah.
really want to talk about the book, but that's okay. No, this is good. So our film Humbert is this hapless innocent in a depraved world, right? He doesn't make a choice that we admire. We're not like, oh yeah, good job picking a teenage girl. But I think it's clear we're meant to sympathize with his reasons for making that choice.
Right.
You know, we're like, yeah, given your options,
Right.
it makes sense. So, do we see innocence in a depraved world in Lynch's films?
Yeah, all the time.
All
the time. And also just, of course, like in Twin Peaks, there are numerous examples. We've got, like sweet characters like Andy and Lucy and stuff that like, they're in the middle of this very dark circumstance. But we also see it in Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, like Lost Highway. Like there's literally so many examples if we really think about it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Eraserhead. I think of poor Henry Spencer, right?
Yeah.
Wandering around with that. I mean, Jack Nance captures that confused, befuddled, disturbed, but slightly hopeful face, right?
Yeah.
That he spends most of the film with. And, we do see like Henry Spencer almost seduced by his would-be mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Right? Like the beautiful girl across the hall, seducing him and then like the next day not interested in him at all anymore.
Right.
And so in that world, and even the quote baby,
Yeah.
right, which is just a hideous monstrosity.
Right.
It can't give or receive love. It just laughs at him.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so creepy.
It's so horrible. I think we don't feel sad
No.
when he kills the baby. No, that's not a baby.
It's just not.
So while some may interpret his act as horrible, right?
Right.
That he puts an end to the hideous alien baby, we can understand his reasons for doing it. He is an innocent in a depraved world.
Right.
He is surrounded by nothing but kind of emptiness and depravity.
Right. And Mulholland Drive, too. I mean, literally, both of our two lead heroines for most of the film. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there because of the way that things sort of unfold as you get further into the film. But when we first meet them early on, both of them, that's why they cling to each other so much, too, is they see that innocence in each other, the way that they're so trusting with each other.
Rita and Betty.
Yes, yeah. It's just the way that they, I mean, because even whenever Rita first shows up, Betty is like, oh, there's a strange woman in my apartment, but it's probably fine.
Oh my gosh, it's so true.
And like, it's like she's like on the phone with her aunt. Well, not just her aunt, but like everyone who like hears about this is like, oh, sweetie, that's pretty weird. Maybe you should part ways with her. And she's like, but why?
Right.
But also, Rita doesn't mean her any harm.
No.
That's the thing, too.
No.
It's like they're just both very innocent together.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, the depraved world here is Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
It's the
100%.
Hollywood machine that's going to spit out these sweet innocents and just destroy them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Blue Velvet.
Yes. Blue Velvet, I mean, it's just absolutely rife with it. And one thing that we've sort of talked about, too, is that when I was reading Room to Dream, which Hilary has also read, there is a moment that they talk about in David Lynch's childhood that sort of inspired the scene in Blue Velvet, which was that when he was a child, he and his brother, they were out playing or something, and a woman came out like naked and I think slightly battered from the woods. And they just, that up until that point, they had just had this completely idyllic childhood. It was like a very safe neighborhood. Nothing had ever really gone wrong. And then that's the point where they were faced with, oh God, what is out there in the world? No explanation, but they could tell that something was wrong. And Lynch said that his brother just started crying, and so it's like, and then when we see in Blue Velvet just like, the cycles of abuse and the ways that you sort of get trapped into it. Because it is, at certain points, it's like, is she enjoying this?
Oh,
it's like,
yeah, Dorothy.
Yeah. It's just like, I think that there's just so many examples in that, because it is just such a harsh world to, it's like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So thinking of Dorothy as potentially like the innocent in the depraved world.
Yeah.
Right? Certainly Jeffrey.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that is maybe the basis of that whole story.
Right. Yeah. It's just really like, I mean, that's the thing is that he just comes in and like, I mean, he's really thrown into such a dark situation.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, he seeks it out, right?
That's true.
He pursues it.
Yeah.
Another interesting parallel I see with, with Kubrick's Humbert kind of being corrupted by his depraved world. We see that with Jeffrey.
Yeah.
In his encounters with Dorothy when she says, "Hit me."
Yeah.
And he does. Like, he hates what is happening to him.
Right.
As a result of contact with this depraved world.
Right.
Maybe Dorothy hates what's happening to her as a
Right.
result of her contact with Frank Booth.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's the thing is really my takeaway from Blue Velvet is so much about the cycles of abuse.
Yes.
Just in the way that it perpetuates itself and the way that we get stuck in these patterns and then other people get sucked into those patterns too, you know?
Perfect. Yeah.
And I think that is like a huge part of this too with like the innocent and the depraved world. It's like at what point do they lose that innocence? And is that innocence taken away from them by people who have also had their innocence taken away?
Yeah.
Which kind of brings up a lot with Humbert if we
Sure.
think about his past. Because the whole thing is that the reason why he's stuck, well, at least in the novel, they don't really touch on it at all in the movie, but he's stuck in this pattern of seeking out these, what he calls nymphettes, these young
Yes.
girls, because when he was a child, his lover at the time, I mean, well, they were children, but his little girlfriend died before they could like consummate anything.
Yeah.
And so he's forever attracted to that. And that's like so much trauma to unpack.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't excuse his actions.
On no level. And I don't think Nabokov wants us to
No,
see that
not
as
at all.
excusing his actions at all. Yeah.
But it is very much an example of that, trauma. And then he's inflicting that trauma onto Lolita.
Yeah. I think that Wild at Heart is an interesting take on this whole innocence in a depraved world thing too, because Sailor and Lula, right? The love story in hell, according to Lynch's description of Wild at Heart. I mean, they really are, to some extent, they are the innocents. They are passionately in love. They're crazy about each other. They're adorable. And everyone around them is just so evil.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's just like it's this dark world.
Right. And as long as the other interesting parallel with Lolita is in the film Lolita, and definitely also in the novel, Humbert and Lolita have to keep moving.
Yes.
It's very much a road book
Yes.
and road novel, because it's when they stay too long in one place, Humbert starts to feel paranoid about the attention they're getting.
Yep. Which we do see too. There are times where people are like, hey, maybe we're having some questions about this arrangement you
Weird
have going
vibes.
on here.
Yeah, right. And so in that motion, he feels he can keep their relationship safer, right, in that motion. Now, that's a horrible version of this. I think in Wild at Heart, we see a really sweet version of this. It's by staying in motion that Sailor and Lula are able to kind of stay together, right?
It's more lovers on the road rather than horrifying situation on the road running from maybe getting caught by the authorities for pedophilia.
Right. And so when we see them stop, in Big Tuna, and Bobby Peru, basically this horrible, depraved individual, right, corrupts both of them.
Yeah.
And that horrifying scene with Lula in the hotel room, and then with convincing Sailor to go through with this, robbery that goes terribly wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are the innocents in the depraved world as well.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah. And finally,
Lost Highway.
But we see this as kind of a transition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so where do we see an innocent in a depraved world in Lost Highway?
I mean, definitely the Pete and Alice story, because I mean, it's like the way that she is like so domineering,
Alice.
and yes, and like controlling and everything. I mean, like that's the way that we're led to believe Lolita is through the film.
Yeah, she even looks a little bit like Lolita,
Yeah,
doesn't she?
the
With
blonde.
the blonde. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and her coldness.
Yes.
Right? At first, she's very vulnerable with Pete and even showing up in her white dress, right?
No. Yeah, when we have that first appearance and everything, when they're first getting to know each other, she seems like she's in a tough situation.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, like she's an innocent, you know? We start to think, and he, you know, dives right in, and then it just starts to get like she starts to get colder. It starts to get more unsettling. You're like, okay, wait, there's like way more at play here. And it's like, okay, so she's maybe controlling him into getting into quite a bad situation.
Definitely. I just rewatched this again this week.
Yeah.
And that moment where she starts telling him the plan for how they're going to get Andy, right? And the camera is just still on her face, straight on, and she's just listing it out, no hesitation. It's so rehearsed and scripted. She's got the whole thing set. You really do feel like Pete. Right?
Yeah.
Poor Balthazar Getty. Right? He is just getting sucked into this machine that was all set before him. This is nothing about like her responding to their relationship.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, not at all. This is that she has had a plan and she's found someone to help her carry it out.
Yeah. And isn't that very similar to film Lolita? In the conclusion of the film, she reveals to film Humbert that she and Quilty had a relationship all along.
Yeah. Yeah. She makes it so you really feel bad for him, because it seems like she's just like, oh, you poor idiot, kind of. Because she's like, well, do you remember this situation? And he's like, yeah, what does that have to do? And she's like, no, it all comes together. It was the same guy the whole time, but you were basically too stupid to pick up on it.
Right. And she had this relationship with Quilty even before she ever met Humbert.
Yeah.
And now, of course, that's all an invention for the film.
Right.
But it does resonate in the Pete and Alice story.
Yes,
You know?
100%.
Once Andy falls into the table in Lost Highway and, you know, dies. And Pete says, we killed him. And Alice says, you killed him. It's really, really disturbing.
Yeah.
And again, feels very Lolita, very
Yes.
calculating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, she is presented as being so much more calculating, so much more in charge of the situation.
Film Lolita.
Yes. Yeah. Much more than Book Lolita.
Yeah.
Book Lolita is unfortunately trapped along for the ride. But Film Lolita is the one driving the car, essentially. I mean, not actually, but essentially.
And so is Alice, right?
Yeah.
In Lost Highway, you know. And I think that when they go to Andy's mansion, you know, and it's almost like this innocent in a depraved world is on overdrive there, because there's like the giant projection of the pornography.
I know.
Right?
He just kind of walks in and he's like, what?
No one would do that.
Right.
Like it's so over. Okay, maybe someone would.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people that would.
It's so over the top, exaggerated how Pete is just this babe in the woods.
Yeah.
Like I love you, Alice. And he goes to this mansion where like there's, you know, her in a pornographic film is just huge on the wall.
Right.
He doesn't have a chance.
Right.
Yeah. But because this is Lost Highway, nothing is what it seems.
No.
Right. And so I don't know. There's a lot of ways to read Lost Highway.
Yeah. I mean, as with many of Lynch's films.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I mean, the same thing could be said about Mulholland Drive. It's just the way that things get, you know, switched around. We have different timelines. We have different situations and everything. that's kind of the beauty of Lynch's films, is that you can watch them a million times and take something different away every single time.
Definitely. And I know that Lynch has talked about Lost Highway being in response to O.J. Simpson, right? And he talks about like, I can't quote him here, but he talks about like in order to commit such an act and then be able to go about your life, it's like being in a psychogenic fugue. Yeah. Right? And so one way of reading Lost Highway is that the innocent in a depraved world is Fred's psychogenic fugue. Yeah. It's not the reality. In reality, Fred is a vicious murderer. Right. He's maybe some aspect of himself or in his imagination, who knows? Right. But the whole Pete Dayton thing is perhaps the illusion, right? This is what he wants to see himself as.
Right. He wants to find a way to justify it.
Which is very much like
Humbert.
Yeah. So I think we can see Lost Highway as a nice transition away from the film Lolita and more into the essence of the book.
Yeah. Which the thing is, when we think about Laura, there's she while there are some similarities, of course, to the film Lolita, there's so many with the book, because it's just really, again, as you probably know, if you're listening to this podcast, you're familiar with Laura and her situation. She is very much stuck in a dark place against her will.
Well, there are some similarities between Laura Palmer, and so we're talking Fire Walk with Me, Twin Peaks. Yeah. First, visually, right?
Yeah.
With Laura and Sue Lyons.
Right. I mean, that was one of the first things when we first talked about this as a possibility for the episode, was you pulled up pictures of Sue Lyon and I'm so sorry,
Cheryl Lee.
James Mason. Yeah, and James Mason. And to compare them to Lauren Leland. And like even just the way that their characters are styled, like the fluffy blonde hair and everything. I mean, they look eerily similar.
Yeah.
It is spot on.
We'll put those pictures on Instagram.
Yes,
right?
we will do a little grid comparison. I'll make that quite easily.
So visually, there are stunning similarities between Laura and film Lolita and Leland and James Mason's Humbert. Yeah. Another similarity that I noticed was in Fire Walk with Me, Laura's manipulation of Bobby. So in that scene where he's challenging her and she suddenly smiles. She's like, oh, come on, Bobby.
She's like, come on, Bobby. And he's like, okay.
And he does that amazing backward walk. That could be a scene between Humbert and Lolita.
100%.
In the film.
Yeah, because she has him eating out of the palm of her hand.
Yes.
We mentioned a little bit briefly in this episode so far, but there's this scene where she is lounging on the bed and he is like painting her toenails, which seems like such a degrading thing almost. And then and he tries to like stand up for himself by being like, he's like, I do everything. He's like, I pay all the bills. I'm the one that cleans everything. I buy you anything you want. And she's like, oh, come here. Don't you love me? Oh, don't you still love me? And he's like, of course I do.
Yeah, they have a big fight at one of the places they're living after her play in the film. And then she runs off to a payphone, we know later to call Quilty.
Yes.
But then he finds her in the payphone booth. And she right away is like, oh, everything's fine. Let's run away together. And again, she's just manipulating and using him.
Right. So it's like a complete 180 from where she was when she left the house. Like he's ready to be angry with her, but she's like, oh, don't be mad. I've decided to do all the things that you want, and I'm just going to go along with it. And we're going to be so happy together, aren't we?
Right. Oh, and I guess I should have mentioned that we're now in chapter 4.
Yes.
This is Lolita and Laura Palmer.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've left the innocent in a depraved world bit, for sure.
Now we're talking Lolita and Laura.
Yeah. Now, we also know from The Secret Diary, of course, that Laura uses her sexuality as a tool to claim and assert her power in a variety of situations. But I think drastically unlike film Lolita, Laura's acting all the time from a place of deep violation and pain.
Yeah.
She, in reality, is much, much closer to Nabokov's Lolita.
Yeah, definitely. Because the thing is that the way that Laura is using it is that she is trying to reclaim that power if she can. She's trying to think like, okay, I'm doing this on my terms for sure.
Yeah.
You know, like when she starts, you know, like getting involved in sex work and things like that, it seems very much that she is doing this trying to reclaim her body.
Yes.
Trying to be in charge, because in a lot of those situations that we do see when we see like, you know, like going sort of backwards and everything in flashbacks and stuff, there's a lot of times where, you know, she is sort of the one in charge, it seems. Not all the time.
Are we
Not all the
talking in
time.
The Secret Diary?
I was talking more like in Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me. And stuff. Well,
yeah.
specifically Fire Walk with Me.
Okay, sure.
But
yeah.
you know, like there's a scene when she snaps and she
yes,
points
yes.
down and
in,
it's like
in the pink room.
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, like scenes like that where it seems like she is trying to really reclaim her sexuality in that way through sex work, and just even in the relationships she has with the men in Twin Peaks.
Oh, yeah. In The Missing Pieces. Have you seen The Missing Pieces?
Not yet.
That's okay. There's this scene, too, where she gets into a truck, right? She's clearly doing sex work, and she gets into the truck, and she's just immediately physically aggressive and threatening to the truck driver. So, yeah, she's going about this, right, this sex work, but she's very dominant.
Right.
And kind of frightening
Yeah.
in it. And I think we see that throughout The Secret Diary, too, that she kind of takes pleasure in terrifying Harold, Josie, right?
Yeah.
But again, unlike the film Lolita, we understand where she's coming from. This is just coming from real pain,
Right.
And violation. So are we leaving film Lolita behind now?
Maybe not forever.
Maybe not forever.
I think
Yeah.
that there's certainly going to be things that maybe we'll talk about, and then I'll be like, oh, right, and then this thing.
So what similarities do we see between the real Lolita and Laura Palmer?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we had talked about that that really is so troubling is that in the way that she is both of them are taken advantage of by what should be trusted adults, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're essentially, you know, so for Laura, it's her father and a lot of other men.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, like, I mean, her therapist, you know, it's like her boss, you know, but with Lolita, it's her stepfather, and then Quilty, who is also, I mean, he's an adult man that like should have been someone that she could have trusted and been safe around. And so it's like, especially, you know, with these situations with these men, they try to justify it. Mm-hmm. They try to justify it by saying that it's love, though.
Yes.
That they're doing this because they love them.
Ben Horn.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And it's like, no, if you loved her, you would not be assaulting her. That's
Right.
just not how that works.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're both 12 years old at the start of their abuse, right? So our book, Lolita, is 12. Laura Palmer in The Secret Diary, we learn is 12 years old. She says that also in Fire Walk with Me,
Yeah,
I think about
so.
Bob.
Yeah.
As Indigo just mentioned, we've got Leland, the father, as the original victimizer in Fire Walk with, in Laura Palmer's life. Mm-hmm. How Humbert becomes Lolita's stepfather is also
So
horrifying. He marries Charlotte, Lolita's mother, intentionally in order to have access to her.
Yeah.
She finds out, this again is in the novel, and it's also a bit in the film. She finds out his intentions. She reads his diary and learns about all of his intentions toward Lolita and the acts he's already committed.
Yeah.
And she's horrified, and she's like, I'm going to tell everyone, I'm going to ruin you. You're never going to see her again. And she runs out of the house and gets hit by a car.
Yep. In the film, they drag it out a little bit more. But yeah, it's...
And
It's
she's killed.
horrifying.
She's
Yeah.
killed. And to me, that's the most terrifying moment in Lolita, the novel, because you suddenly realize as a reader that this girl is now utterly trapped
Yeah.
with this man. He is her only living relative.
Yeah.
He's her stepfather. He's her only guardian. He is all she has, and he is going to enslave her.
Yeah. He has complete control over her now because he's taken away the one person that might have stood up for her, that might have gotten in his way from doing these things. And yeah, that's a horrifying moment because you realize, oh, it's all over now.
It's all over. Yeah, I remember the first time I read it, I had to lower the book and my heart was pounding.
Yeah.
You know, just the thought of this 12-year-old child being trapped for the rest of the novel, basically, with this man.
Well, and especially with the book, you are in the unfortunate situation where you get to look and see, oh, there's so many pages left,
Oh my
too.
gosh, I was just going to say that.
Yeah. You just look down and you're like, okay, so there's so many pages left. So what's going to happen in these pages?
And horrible things happen.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's a lot. I think that we see that with Laura, too.
Yeah.
Right? Laura is utterly trapped.
Yeah, I mean, because her mom is not stepping up. She is zoning out. She is choosing to look away. She's choosing to try to pretend that she isn't seeing what's going on. She's just really clocked out, you know? And one of the things we had talked about was in the way with like film Lolita with the glamorous, like the nail polish and everything.
Oh, yeah.
In comparison, that horrifying scene where Leland grabs her hands and he's like, your nails, you're dirty, wash your hands.
Yeah.
Like in the comparison where, you know, film Lolita and Humbert, he's totally like enslaved to her. He's like painting her toenails. But for Laura, like as a comparison, it's quite the opposite, and it's very horrifying the way that she's being treated. But the big thing that always like really jumped out to me in that scene, that it was already deeply troubling, but the way that her mother doesn't
Stop it. Yeah.
She
We're
just
talking
sort of
about
breaks down.
Fire Walk with Me, the scene in
Yes.
at the dinner table when he said, you have to wash your hands before you eat. Yeah. Right.
And you
right.
see the fear in Laura's eyes as he's grabbing her.
And then she goes into the bathroom to wash her hands and is just absolutely devastated, sobbing. Yeah. Yeah. She's a Fire Walk with Me and The Secret Diary. Both, I think, do such an excellent and horrifying job of showing Laura's loneliness.
Yeah,
And
how
how
isolated.
trapped and isolated she is.
Right. And we see that so much with Lolita. I mean, the thing is, and they do touch on this in the film too, but I feel like it speaks a lot more to it in the book just because of the way that they don't shy away from, you know, portraying his sinister nature. But Humbert is constantly trying to isolate her from her peers.
Especially boys.
Yes, especially boys. And we see, you know, in the way that Leland, you know, like watches her when she's like, you know, like leaving with like James or you know, like any of the times that we see interactions between Leland and Laura that involve her boyfriends. It is very scary and
Possessive.
so possessive,
Jealous.
yeah.
Where
And
did
it's
you
like,
get
why
that?
would it be jealous?
Where did you get that? Is it from a lover?
Yeah. And Humbert is exactly that way too. He's so possessive of her. He doesn't want her interacting with boys her own age because he wants to be the only man in her life, which is horrifying.
Yes. Yes. Our novel Lolita, the book Lolita, is incredibly isolated and lonely. Even when she tries to connect with other girls her age, it's almost too disturbing to talk about.
Yeah.
But Humbert, one scene, she's chatting with another little girl, and Humbert walks up behind her and takes his hand on the back of her neck.
Yeah.
And he physically forces her away and back to the hotel room so he can assault her.
Yep.
So he takes her away from this interaction with another little girl and marches her off to the hotel room. It's horrifying. That's, again, book, not film.
Right.
I think that The Secret Diary, like I said, Fire Walk with Me, and even in the beginning of Twin Peaks, at Laura's funeral,
Yeah.
when Bobby says,
Right.
you know, we all knew she was, I'm not going to quote it right.
I know.
Can you paraphrase?
Yeah. I mean, because we've talked about that. That is one of my favorite scenes in the Bobby character arc, because he's like, we all failed her, basically. I'm also going to misquote it, and I should have looked it up because I knew I was going to bring it up. I knew it. Maybe not in this episode, but I knew I would want to bring it up at some point. But it's just like, yeah, he talks about, he's like, we all failed her. Like, we all played a part in this. We all played a part in Laura's death because none of us got up here and saved her. And we were talking earlier about, there's that interview with Sheryl Lee where she talks about, like, now as a mother, like, that she just is so heartbroken when she watches Twin Peaks or thinks back to it or anything, that she's just like, where were the adults that were looking out for her?
Yeah.
Why did no one do something? Why did no one step in? And it is just so heartbreaking. And I think that, like, I know one of the things in our notes was talking about how a lot of people, a takeaway that people will try to come with this is like, you know, oh, well, with Lolita, it's like, why didn't she say something? You know, that's insane. Yeah. I saw you had pulled a quote for that where it was just like, you know, people.
These are the original critics from the novel Lolita.
Right.
I'm quoting Stacy Schiff's article, Lolita in the Afterlife. So this was from the New Yorker in March of 2021. So there's a lot of good stuff in this article. But she's citing how the critics at the time, when the novel first came out, felt sorry for Humbert, and they really vilified the character of Lolita.
Yeah.
It's in some ways no wonder then that Kubrick's vision kind of came to life.
Right.
It was just read so differently. The novel was read so differently then than we read it now. So she was called... Dorothy Parker called her a dreadful little creature, selfish, hard, vulgar, and foul-tempered. Yeah. A Cornell colleague found her unrealistic. Here's a quote. A self-respecting American girl would never have passively submitted to Humbert. She would have had the good sense to call the police.
Which is just so ridiculous, because if there's anything that we've learned over time, you know, from studies of abuse, specifically of like child abuse and domestic abuse, that is one of the biggest problems, is that they are too afraid to speak up because they are in situations where their lives are at stake.
Yes.
And also it's like we see repeatedly these situations where people, if they wanted to notice that something was wrong, if they wanted to pick up on it, if they wanted to actually care and step in, they could have. But instead, these girls get taken advantage of. Quilty doesn't try to save her. He tries to ruin her even more.
Right.
He tries to hurt her even more. And, you know, all these men in Laura's life, like Jacoby could have, like theoretically, the whole point would be that you tell your therapist that you are being assaulted and they do something instead of falling in love with you.
And seducing you. Or whatever it is that Jacoby's doing. But it's clearly inappropriate.
Right.
Right. So where Laura is going for help, she finds only more, you know, men who are trying to abuse her or whatever. Ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's worth bringing in these quotes from Vera Nabokov. So this is Nabokov's, I'm saying his name the way he doesn't like it to be said, Nabokov's wife. She was a big champion of the novel Lolita. She saved it from the fire. He tried to burn it. She went and rescued it from the fire and really encouraged him to publish it. And she was really distressed by the way critics responded to the character of Lolita. And she emphasized in interviews with her husband, with her family members, she always stressed Lolita's, quote, complete loneliness in the whole world. She said that what critics were failing to notice was, again, this is a quote, the tender description of the child's helplessness, her pathetic dependence on the monstrous Humbert, and her heart-rending courage all along. The critics, she says, forgot that, quote, the horrid little brat, Lolita, was essentially very good indeed. Yeah. She said, finally, of the critics, that Lolita cries every night, and the critics are deaf to her sobs.
Which honestly is just pretty much how things are with victims of abuse in general. I mean, the thing is that it's just, and when we think about Lara, all those times where she is so clearly deeply alone. I mean, they're even just, I mean, she's just such an incredible actress. There are so many scenes that we see her that there's just like a deadness in her eyes, that she's just like lost this light, and it only really comes out when she's performing it for people.
Oh, excellent. Performing the light.
Yeah. But when we see her on her own, she's filled with so much fear all the time, or again, just that like that emptiness, that like deep loneliness. And it's just like we really only see, you know, that colorful side of her, that like bright side of her that attracts so many people when she's putting it on like a mask to be brave, when she's going out into the world and she's trying to be brave. But if she's like walking on her own or something
In school.
Yeah.
That's seen in the hallway at school.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that line I love is this, her heart-rending courage all along. That's Lara.
Right.
Right? I mean, we see Lynch giving that character, Laura Palmer, a chance to show that in Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
That courage, that horrid little brat Lolita was essentially very good indeed. So was Lara.
Yeah.
Right.
Lara was so good. And the thing is too, it's like we see all of these people that love her so much, you know, but it's just like at the end of the day, Bobby calls it out. Bobby calls it out that no one really stepped up. When there were countless opportunities, they all failed her.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And in the same way, it happens so many times to Lolita as well.
Yeah. Definitely.
There's so many times that, you know, neighbors or you know, people on the road could have jumped in and said, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? And nobody really does. Or if somebody tries to, of course, like Humbert scoops her away right away.
Yeah.
You know? And yeah, it's really heartbreaking to watch.
One thing I think is interesting is that Lolita as a novel is obviously misunderstood in its time, right? We appreciate it so differently now and really see what the author intended, what was happening here. I think something similar happened with Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
Think how that was received
Right.
when it first was released, and think how it's endured and people have come to such an appreciation of this.
Right. I mean, I would say it's very much like a cult classic status at this point.
Oh, yeah. Like no one would dare make the kinds of comments now that were made about it when it was first released.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's because the themes that both of these texts touch on, pedophilia, child abuse, incest, are so horrible, or were so horrible for the American public to digest,
Right.
that instead of receiving these texts and kind of processing them and facing the reality that they're depicting, we just said, oh, that's it. It's a terrible film.
Right.
It's a terrible book. Lolita's such a brat, right?
Yeah.
That it's almost as if we could not, we were not willing to come to a reckoning with that in our kind of human experience, our culture.
Right. No, I think that happens all the time. I think it happens all the time with films, shows, books, even like music albums. Like people just, it's so much easier to just say, well, I just don't like it. I think it's just bad.
Yeah.
Because you can't take the time to really sit down and process it. It's so much easier to just say, well, no, I'm just not even really going to interact with it. No, I just think it's terrible. I think it's garbage. It's just so much easier to put out that than to say, well, I guess actually I need to really sit with this. I need to sit down and really process this for a long time. This is such a horrifying idea, but it happened. That's the worst part too, is it happens all the time.
It does.
There's so many situations of real abuse happening all the time. And when we are faced with media like this, it's that reminder too. And people don't want to think about that that's happening.
Right. Right. We talked before we started recording about the Cheryl Lee effect.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. You should speak on that.
Oh, no.
I really loved, yeah.
Oh, I was quoting something I'd read, but Courtney Stallings' book, Lara's Laura's Ghost, Women Speak About Twin Peaks, has an interview with Cheryl Lee where she talks about going to conventions and women coming up to her and sharing their own personal stories of abuse. There's something about Laura Palmer's character and story that, well, obviously resonates very deeply with women who have experienced abuse, and presumably men as well.
Yeah.
And it's such a beautiful burden that she's taken on as an actress, right? Yeah. To hold these stories.
Right.
And create space for these people who feel the need to tell her, right? That they're speaking to the woman, Cheryl Lee, but also to the character, Laura. Right. Yeah.
I mean, and the thing is, like, I think we were sort of saying too, like, I mean, I think any videos I've ever seen of like interviews with her or anything, she just seems like such an incredibly kind soul. Mm-hmm. And I think that she has become such a beautiful champion for survivors. Because again, we talk about that courage too. Yeah. And we see Laura's courage. We see her fighting every day. And it really speaks to survivors. I mean, that's why we call them survivors. It's like, yeah, you're fighting every day, just whether you're in this situation or even once you get out of it, fighting every day to not let that trauma consume you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the last quote I have that I want to read is actually from Aziz Nafisi, who wrote the book Reading Lolita in Tehran. Mm. She says of Lolita, the novel's character, Lolita belongs to a category of victims who have no defense and are never given a chance to articulate their own story. As such, she becomes a double victim. Not only her life, but also her story is taken from her. And love that.
Yeah.
And that's so true of novel Lolita.
Yeah.
And what I think one of the many things I love about David Lynch is that he refused to let that happen to Laura.
Yeah.
He staked his whole career, basically. I mean, he was temporarily ruined by Fire Walk with Me.
Right.
It was worth it to him to let Laura tell her story.
Right. And I mean, we were just watching those clips of the interview with the Palmer family.
Yes.
And I mean, at the end, he's just like, bless you, Laura. And you can tell how much he loves her, how much he loves this character, and how protective he is of her.
Yes.
How deeply he wants her to be okay and to survive. And it's one of those tricky things that happens with writing where it's like sometimes you completely fall in love with a character that you've created. You feel so protective of them and everything, but it is just unfortunately part of the narrative that they do not survive.
Right.
And it is so heartbreaking. It's like you've created this child and you know that there's no way that you can save them because it's just how the narrative has to go. And then,
sounds like Cooper.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's something we can unpack.
Yeah. Yeah.
So desperate to save her.
Right. And obviously we all know that that's just basically David Lynch. I mean we know. And it's just, it is just, you can see, I feel like so often in a lot of like interviews and stuff, when he talks about Laura, it's just so different from anything.
Yeah.
He loves Laura so much and he's so devoted to her and protective of her. And it's hard because unfortunately she is in this very dark world.
Right, right. You know, when I first watched the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, I didn't realize that I had this reaction, but after I saw Fire Walk with Me, I said to my partner who I watched it with the first time, I said, oh, now I understand Laura.
Yeah.
Because when I watched the first 2 seasons, she seemed too contradictory to be real. She was like the good girl who did Meals on Wheels. She's also a sex worker who's addicted to drugs. And she's the homecoming queen with this idyllic portrait. And I thought, she can't even be a real character. How can she is just a projection of all these people's perceptions of her. And then I saw Fire Walk with Me and it absolutely tied it all together. I was like, oh, that's how she's all those things at once. Right. And And that's where I think it comes back to that quote about Lolita, that about her being robbed of her own story.
Right.
That maybe the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks didn't let Laura's story come out. Instead, we have Leland's story.
Right.
Poor Leland. Oh, boo-hoo.
Oh, possessed Leland.
Oh, yeah, he didn't mean... Can you tell we're skeptical?
Right.
Oh, we're a little skeptical. He was possessed. Wah.
Yeah. And even in those, in the, David Lynch interviews, the Palmer family thing, that
Yes.
we talked about, folks, if you haven't seen this, it's phenomenal. Because the thing is that while David is interviewing Leland, he looks so skeptical the whole time.
He's stone-faced.
And Leland is saying, that was not me. I didn't do those things. That wasn't me. And the whole time, David just looks furious and just like, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one way to read his facial expression.
Right. It's like almost like such a comparison between the way that then he responds to Laura. It's like, he so clearly loves her so much, but with Leland, you can tell that he hates this character. Maybe. He's like made this character and he has like no sympathy for him. I don't think he does.
Okay.
I think at least from that interview, that's the vibe that I got.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this is like a special feature that is on some version of a DVD of Twin Peaks. It's David Lynch as himself interviewing Leland, Sarah, and Laura.
Yeah.
Laura and Leland have been dead 25 years.
Yeah.
And so he's asking them about their lives. We'll probably talk more about those interviews.
Yeah.
In other episodes. Yeah, really, really good. I also think in Fire Walk with Me, we see a much less sympathetic view of Leland.
Yeah, definitely. We see the darkness in him.
Yes.
And it is terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. So ultimately, Lynch lets Laura reclaim her story.
Yeah.
Right? And gives her this opportunity. And so, of course, does The Secret Diary.
Yes.
By Jennifer Lynch.
Yeah, I think, and even just like in season 3 in The Return, it's like we get so much too that I think is reclaiming for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Well, I think we're finished with this episode.
I think so.
Excellent. So our next topic episode is going to be on The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane.
Which is another one that David Lynch has actually made direct references to. You can literally see it in Twin Peaks.
Yeah, it's alluded to twice in Twin Peaks. We hear that line. So that's a book and a movie. We'll talk about both. And we'll see if we can unpack the connections between that story and especially Twin Peaks: The Return. We're planning to do episodes
once a month, I'd say, to start, and then maybe we can maybe if you guys are really loving it and you're like so desperate for it, we can try to do like 2 a month. But I think right now we're aiming for 1 a month. But don't hold us to that forever.
We're overthinkers.
We are.
Over planners.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening. Yeah. And once again, this has been The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
And to sort of sign off, we've been, as we said, overthinking a way to sort of sign off. And we've decided, in honor of Harriet, it was Laura. And she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye, listeners.
And hot.